you look at somewhere like India now, why are we getting so many Indian tech people through the US, Europe, UK, Asia, Africa, everywhere? Well, it's simply because they invested heavily in the Indian Institutes of Technology, really from the 50s and the 60s onwards. And you're seeing the net result of that hugely competitive system to get into, massively talented people coming out of it. And we haven't gone anywhere near that. And that comes back again, I think, to, well, as a nation, what do we really want out of this? Because we've created a mass system where, in effect, it's pretty open. And I think these days, something like 60% of enrolments in the universities are probably in business programs.
Yep.
And then there's a big sort of outcry about, well, we're not getting enough STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We're not getting enough people in that. And you'll have seen the comment the other day from one of the sector people saying, well, we can't get people in. Well, you've then got to ask yourself the question, why is that? And how do we deal with it? And what do we do to fix that? Because when you look at what both sides of politics now, both major sides of politics now are saying, is that they want a much smarter economy. Well, there's only one place that's going to come from, and it's going to come out of a much sharper higher education and technological education sector that's actually working in sync. And at the moment, we don't have that.
It does seem that most obviously in the United States, but also in Europe and here in Australia, universities have got caught up in the culture wars. And in particular, the perception that is predominantly, but not exclusively on the right of the political spectrum, that universities have become a haven for so-called elitists whose concerns are remote from those of ordinary people. And that's fueled the drive on one side of the political spectrum to cut funding for universities and so on. And we're obviously seeing that particularly in the United States now. But to what extent do you think it's fair to say that universities have themselves contributed to that perception? And if there is some substance in that, what should the universities be doing to counter it?
Oh, again, great question. And I think in all fairness, the university sector has probably not been its own best advocate over the last period of time, certainly here and perhaps elsewhere as well, because there's been a fair amount of that in the UK as well. And if anything, the UK at the moment, that sector is going through even more horrifying activity than we are here, because there's serious economic shortfalls. Buried in this, there's some really interesting things, because let me go back quickly to that point just made. The overwhelming number of enrolments in the university sector is in business programs. And it always fascinates me that people then say, well, it's a leftist institution. I'm not sure. Last time I looked, there weren't that many people on the hard left coming out of business programs and going into business in Australia. So immediately, I think you're talking about a very small sector of the universities. I think what's driven it, though, Saul, is again this idea about the universities. I think there's a school of thought saying they should be more utilitarian than they are. When you and I went, the numbers were small, the programs were flexible, there was a lot of time for reflection, you read widely, there wasn't a lot of pressure, you did a year-long course, you did all of that stuff. And then from about really massively from the Dawkins period onwards, we started to get these tailor-made degrees. I remember when I first became a dean in Canberra, this is the early 90s, I had a public relations degree that had 24 subjects in it, and only one of those subjects was a free elective choice. So we had to go back and sort of open up the system to allow students a lot more choice to read across the curriculum, read across the disciplines, and do all those sort of things. Once it started to get into this utilitarian mold, the obvious question that governments raise is, well, and now you see it reflected in one of the major tests governments of either side put on it, these people employed in their fields within 6 months of graduation. Well, that pays no attention to the fact that the workforce profiles changed dramatically over the course of 40 or 50 years and is changing even more rapidly now. So this again comes back to the idea, well, what skills should we be having? And the challenge around the culture wars is that the idea was that reading, for me, reading widely and thinking philosophically has suddenly become an anathema because somehow that's not job worthy. And we've become very struck in Australia, I think, about you have to be employed within the area that you've got. And I remember saying to people, not that long ago that sort of one or two people employed in the big four consultancy firms actually had a history degree and got near the top of that sector. So we've gone away from the idea that understanding culture, if you like, is actually a great social tool and an educational and a practical tool for outcome purposes. We've gone away from that and think, well, you have to be trained in a utilitarian discipline, economics, business management, whatever it happens to be. And anything that's different from that is seen as a leftist thing. And that's been aggravated, of course, by the rise of movement, not postmodernism, and all of the rest of it. And that's been seen as some kind of bad thing happening in the universities. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why when trimming the budgets to happen is that the obvious target has been the arts, humanities, and the social sciences. You've taken a fair hit. And, of course, frequently there's not much of an understanding that there's as many divisions between right and left in the universities and those departments as there are outside.
It does seem to me that one particular adverse development of what you described as the way in which the arts and humanities and so forth have been singled out in this way is the decline in the teaching and learning of Asian languages and culture and history, and to some extent European languages and culture and history as well, that in a world that's increasingly reliant on an understanding of how different people think and behave, including in the business context, of course, successive generations of younger Australians know less about the history and cultures and languages of the people in our region than they did when I was at university or when you were.
That's a really powerful point. And the Australian Association of Asian Studies 3 or 4 years ago had a survey around this. And it demonstrably so, what you're referring to is that proportionately, we've massified the system, but proportionally, the number of people studying language and culture has declined dramatically. And there's sort of some ironies in here where I first started as a historian of India. And Australia had some of the best centres for the study of Indian history and culture and the social sciences anywhere in the world. Yet now, when we're actually rushing towards India at a vast rate of knots at the government level, we've got fewer centres dedicated to that actual study than we did back then. And people have made much the same point about the study of Indonesia, even about China, ironically enough. It's getting harder to get funds into those. There's been a lot of discussion about where they go. And a lot of the focus has become either on business, and this applies to India and China particularly, at least the way I see it, it's gone towards business or it's gone to security.
Well, certainly that. And I mean, my sense would be that, if anything, the importance of economists and people running businesses understanding how countries like China and Indonesia and India work is more important than it's ever been.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's one of the planks that we're going to have to be pushing very hard over the next while as this sort of reformation of the system takes place. Simply because I think what we're seeing now is we're bearing the results of some of that in the way in which our relationships with, say, ASEAN and even with the Pacific have come under pressure. And a lot of it has come down just to basic misunderstanding about each other's ambitions and ideas and objectives and how we might actually work together. And look, there's people around who are trying to do their very best to make sure those things happen. But it's very clear inside the university system. There's actually fewer major programs devoted to India now than there were probably when I was doing the PhD. And that's a pretty serious matter when we're rushing towards India in some response, in some part as a sort of knee-jerk response to trying to regularise our relationship with China, which is going particularly well. Those are the sort of areas where I think the universities have a major part to play, and that includes being much more interactive with the more technological sides of those societies. I mean, and you can see China's actually it's a great example, because back in the late 90s, China decided that it needed to improve its university system. So it picked what they thought were the top 100 universities, gave them a serious amount of money to develop 2 particular areas of research each, went back a few years later, gave them another dollop of money to build it, got up to about the top 35. A few years ago, did the same thing again. The net result after 30 years or so of that sort of serious investment is that their citations in the learned journals have increased hundreds-fold. Their citations, their patents and indexes, their innovations have gone up dramatically. And of course, we've still flatlined. Now, yes, it's much easier to run a unified system in there than it is here. The money was, the decision was made to make it that long-term decision and investment. The results are there. Somehow we've got to find a way in our system to do the same thing, but within the strictures that we have.
And that surely raises the possibility that at some point, not in the next 5 years or so, but maybe in the following 10 to 20, that aspiring students from countries in our region won't see it as necessary to come to universities in Australia to get the best possible education, that their own universities in China and India, NUS, Singapore is already a world leader and attracting students from other parts of the world in the way that our universities do. Is there a risk that the model on which universities have come to depend over the last 25 years or so could, at some point in the next 25 years, disappear?
There's zero doubt about that, Saul. And have a look at one very good example. When I first got involved in the international sector way back, when it really first started in the late 80s, early 90s, our major source of supply was from Malaysia.
Right.
Now, the numbers of Malaysian students we've got is still noticeable, but it pales into insignificance against China and India. And part of that is because Malaysia now has a huge amount more self-reliability than it did back 30 years ago. I worked up there for about 3 years, and I think back in the 90s, there was something like 9 universities. There's now 30 or 40, and they're all doing very well. Right. So that growth of self-reliability is a serious factor. And of course, that's been one of the things that the sector has been saying to both sides of government, whoever was in power, over the last 20 years, is that, yes, that will run out at some point, and we need to be much more self-reliant. And of course, that goes back to the question about, well, what's the funding package that the feds are going to put up in order to support this growth?
So, Brian, we've been talking about the problems in Australia's tertiary education sector for a while. We could start talking about what ought to be done to deal with the problems that we've been identifying. So could I invite you to offer your vision as to what needs to change in order to ensure that some of the bad outcomes we've been fretting about don't actually come to pass?